So I'm with my colleague Mariam Mutimadi Fraser, the co-director of the Methods Lab. And the Methods Lab is basically premised on the notion of having conversations across disciplines, but not only amongst academics, with people outside of the academy. And that doesn't only mean those people we might interview or do field work with, but also professionals in other fields. So museum professionals, artists, filmmakers, musicians. And the Method Lab has been in existence for, I think, almost 10 years now. And in fact, Alessandro Potelli was one of our earlier annual, annual Methods lecture speakers. And I have to say, he's been quite inspiring for my work. He's been one of my inspirations, because you would have probably have heard how he used to use his oral history to work with musicians, to work with theatre practitioners, and in fact he used to make vinyl records from his oral histories, although the business didn't ever take off. They flopped and most of them sat around in his office or at home. Yes, so at the moment, of course, we're in this climate of having to show our impact. And I have to say, we like to sidestep that conversation. We don't want the very rich traditions within social sciences, humanities, the arts, on how one can be a public intellectual. Essentially, that's what the conversation is. How can you be a public intellectual? We don't want that to be governed or curtailed by the impact agenda. In fact, we were having this conversation, or academics have been having it for years, hundreds of years before the governance on us to show impact materialise. And I think we need to pay attention to that tradition of public engagement that has been there for some time if we're going to deliver a rich notion of what public engagement can be, not only what it can be, but the troubled zone it is. Because often we assume C. Wright Mills has talked about the public intellectual quite extensively, especially public sociology and the sociological imagination, which is my discipline. And he makes quite a funny remark when he says, well, academics just assume that the public's waiting for them. I mean, do the public really want to hear what they've got to say? So we often make a lot of assumptions about our own self-importance, and that there's quite a lot of work involved in thinking through who our constituency is or could be. Essentially, I don't actually think about who my public is. I don't have a set public, and but I work with the public modes of engagement. So this is why I have the line here, Walls of the Academy. We often think it all happens in the university. Most of our research, you all know, happens somewhere else. And it's all those relationships that you build over time. But also the public explication of our research usually happens in conferences. At the same time, it can happen in other institutions. It can happen in, festivals. It can happen in museums. And also, you can turn the walls of the academy around, as we have with this corridor. This is our third exhibition that we've had in the Kingsway corridor. The first one was called Pierre Bourdieu in Algeria, when Pierre Bourdieu took nearly 1,000 photographs when he was in Algeria in the 50s and 60s. And he kept most of those photographs in a box. He kept a few... he kept bringing them out for conversations, but not publicly, and a few appeared on the covers of his books, but most of them were in a box. So only 50 years later, what became the end of his life, he decided he'd make it into an exhibition, and he worked with a gallery and an archive in Austria called Camera Grass to bring this out, this whole exhibition, to put it together. So we had it in the corridor for a year. And 2 years ago, we had another exhibition called Conversations with Edward Said and Jean Moore on Palestine, which was taken from their book After the Last Sky. So essentially, we've used a model where we use academic images, produced in academic projects, images and text, and place them in an exhibition. This year we've done something slightly different where we've asked artists to respond to the book A Seventh Man by John Berger and Jean Moore, and to put the conversation on the walls in a different way. So you will see chalk drawings and wire, different kinds of material formations, put the book in the corridor and give it a different life. Also, Seventh Man was actually translated into lots of non-European languages, so Korean, Turkish, and we've used those. And in fact, we've created new translations because we are wanting to engage with different publics. Yesterday, my colleague Mariam Mortimadi Fraser actually worked with a local Afghan women's group, and for that group, she translated excerpts from Seventh Man into Farsi. So we have a Farsi record of sections of Seventh Man, and the last section of the exhibition at the end actually has new translations in Punjabi, because a collaborator with Seventh Man, Amarjit Jandan, has translated Berger into Punjabi. So he translated some excerpts for us to use. So there's also the issue of language, which is prolific, and translation is not only about language, though, it's also about the translation of materials. So the words people have given you, how do you translate them into other forms? And often the most exciting way to do that is to collaborate with other professionals, musicians, artists, museum practitioners. So I'm going to quickly talk about my projects, and this slide just condenses quite a lot of theoretical influences on my work. So my work's on space, and I'm interested in how space is produced, but also how it's imagined, how it's multi-dimensional, so it exists in many zones, and it's layered, bounded, sedimented, but something that you can move. And I operate from that basis. There's lots of thinkers which have obviously brought me to this position. Feminist thinkers like Elizabeth Grosz, French theorists who wrote The Production of Space, Henri Lefebvre, many of you will know, de Soto's work, a whole range of thinkers. Even Portelli actually works on layers of space quite extensively through his oral histories. So in sociology, there's actually a big tradition which goes back to the 1930s of working with publics. And my discipline used to have a building in Chelsea when Chelsea wasn't so expensive. And in this house, they actually had exhibitions, they had collaboration with the arts and crafts movement, and they had field visits, surveys. So it's a place of building projects, but the projects were not only surveys, or they included surveys. However, in our textbooks, this tradition has been forgotten. It's really not there, and in our methods books, we don't really think about how publics were generated through exhibitions or collaborations with the arts and crafts movement. And there are other traditions that have influenced me and my thinking. So, for instance, some of you may know this film. If you don't, you should watch it. Chronicle of a Summer, and it's built on actually a series of oral histories, really long oral histories involving walks, dinners, coffees, with several actors, not actors but people, in Paris, and they were asked the question by Jean Rouch and Morin, are you happy? And now there's a happiness industry, but it wasn't in that context, because there were lots of troubled histories that emerged just through that one question. And Rouch and Morin actually put this film together, and it's interesting the tensions that they came up against in the collaboration, because collaboration itself is not very easy when we step outside of our discipline. We might have plenty of fights in our discipline, but we'll have even more when you leave the discipline. There's a lot of attraction to leaving the discipline, but there are also different notions operating in that exchange. So, for instance, Jean Rouch was more of a surrealist and more of an anthropologist, and Edgar Morin is a social scientist. And there is all this tension in how the film should be constructed, how much of the surrealism should come out. And you will find these tensions when you collaborate. Now I'm going to give you another example from Aftab Bra's work, a film called Arjgal, which means today and yesterday. And what she did, she worked with a Asian elders group in Southall and asked them what they wanted to learn in terms of just education. She was based in an extramural studies department at Birkbeck, and they said they wanted to learn about video making. This was in the 90s. And most of these people were elderly. Some of them had never been to school. And they brought in a video trainer who worked with them for 6 weeks. So they built a script. They actually created new language, Punjabi language, for dealing with the cameras. And mainly the women led the way in this filmmaking, the elder women. And towards the end of the film, they actually have a performance where they're dancing amongst themselves as a celebration. You can look that up. I've actually written an article on that. So there's lots of examples, and Bruno Latour is the most well-known social scientist, but he's in fact the only one who's usually quoted, so I'm not going to talk about him much because there's lots of others. And then we have the International Visual Sociology Association, which really does work on the visual but also audio. And there's a tradition that's been going on for some time called public sociologies from Burraway, trying to make a call out to sociologists that you have to get public in different ways. And there's been lots of dispute around that. And certainly my own discipline, sociology, is terrible at being public. And I offer this as an example from the 2014 annual conference. Doing something public beyond the church-like paper presentations that we do is to have poster displays in conferences. I actually get incredibly annoyed with poster displays because usually it's so limited, the visual exhibit, and usually it's postgraduates who are submitting and they have to pay to submit as well, so there's an economy to the poster. And as I was saying, we like to work before and after the impact agenda, and our corridor helps us in many ways to do that. And this is from when Borgia's exhibition was here, sorry, this one, and then when Edward Said's work was here. So we actually did manage to get his wife Mariam Said to come and talk about the collaboration, how the images and text were put together for After the Last Sky, because that's an issue you will come up against if you're working with the images and text. How do you put it together? And we were lucky enough to have Jean Moore present, so he was photographing us at our event. And now we're in this moment with the exhibition outside. Now I'm going to backtrack a little bit. You must tell me how much time I have left.
Not much.
Right, I'm going to be even faster. I know I'm being filmed, but I'll ignore that. So the first public project I did was in 2000, I think. There used to be a small AHRC scheme called working. I think it was working in public places, something like that. It doesn't exist anymore. So I went to work with a local museum in the city I grew up in, Coventry, Herbert Art Gallery, and they wanted to look at migration histories there's a big South Asian population. Some of the people moved in the interwar period, but largely in the post-war period, because it was a big boom town for the car industry and engineering. And so I suggested to them, instead of doing a normal model for migration, the normal set pattern that we follow, stories or elicit stories through, whereby we ask people, where did you come from? What was your journey like? Where did you settle? Which job did you get? What kind of racism did you experience? Was there any political activism you participated in? I mean, that's like a standard linear pathway we take people through. I presented them with the opportunity of perhaps we should focus on the cinemas that people actually bought in the post-war period when cinema going in England was actually dropping. So these empty cinemas were emerging. And some of the cinemas were brought together by collectives, such as the Indian Workers Collective. I managed to convince them that we could just ask people of their experiences of going to these cinemas. The response was phenomenal. People were coming forward from everywhere to give their stories of going to these cinemas. And in fact, connecting in with the public sphere, for me, that these cinemas are very interesting because they offer I wouldn't go as far as subaltern, but certainly alternative public sphere to what Habermas has been imagining or what Nancy Fraser has been imagining. And because they involved a national and international network of speakers too. They had communist leaders at these cinemas sometimes. At times they had singers there from India or Pakistan, or they even had wrestling matches built into these cinemas. So there are particular scenes, and what I did, we collected all interviews, videos as well, and then we made a film together, 20-minute film, and an exhibition. We recreated a cinema using old seats from cinemas, and the exhibition actually ran for 6 months, which was great. I'm not going to say there weren't any tensions there in terms of the public or my own working with the museum, but these are to be expected, I think. These are to be expected. And the good thing was that the gallery gave 6 months of the space to this exhibition, because that's the other thing you're going to have to look out for. When you go to collaborate with a gallery or a museum, they'll give you the space. It's a battle for space. They usually might give you an annex, or they might give you the space for a week or 2 weeks or a night. And in fact, that's one of the reasons at Goldsmiths we try to use our own walls and make them into galleries, because we're not so, our space isn't so pressured. We're not under the same sort of pressures in terms of turnover and innovation, and we can let things run for a whole academic year and have lots of conversations with whatever we put on. So that was the first project I did, and why did I do it? So I'm interested in my own meeting, really. It was a meeting in a double sense. So I was interested in the materials that I was meeting, the archival materials, the voices, but also the meetings that these people put together. And I put John Berger's novel up there, Here Is Where We Meet, because in there at the start he has a scene in Lisbon where there's an old woman walking towards him, and he feels as if he can recognise her, but he's not sure entirely who she is. He can recognise her gait, and as she becomes closer, he actually realises it's his own mother, who's actually been dead nearly 15 years. And that for me sums up why I was kind of stayed in this project on cinema. And in fact I created I'll have to speed through these. I created 3 films, so I kept returning. The first film was Gubby Ritz, Gubby Palladium, and which was in the gallery, and I put Stuart Hall in there because he's a particular kind of public intellectual who you may also be able to take inspiration from. He helped build what's called Innova, and it's an art gallery, and there they have a Stuart Hall library. Lots of artists exhibit there. So there's these examples that you can pull on. Now the project, I think, was the most public that I ever did, and I did really start dyeing my hair after that, this project, or during the project. It's called Noise of the Past. And it was an AHRC project, but we also called on other funding because the project actually grew as it was in motion, and you will find that your research grows through connections as you're in motion. And you do have to control it sometimes too, even though it's exciting to expand. From this project, we created 2 outputs, as they're called, on the form. One was a film called Unravelling, and another was a live music composition called Post-Colonial War Requiem. This was something that wasn't planned, the Post-Colonial War Requiem. It emerged during the course of the project. And both of them were launched in remembrance in Coventry Cathedral. The whole point of it was to reawaken narratives of war, existing narratives of war and memory, and to open up how we think about war and memory, and to do this by bringing in the voices of the colonies, because the colonies were so central to the wars, but they're still marginal in our memories of the wars. There is, as you know, a governmental structure to memory. It's actually accelerated in the last 10 years as we are in new wars ourselves. But if you think through the materiality of it, there's not a materiality involved in war memory: stone, cloth, visuality, bodies, film projections. All of those materialities are there, and therefore, if you're working with it yourself, you might want to think beyond just the voice, or the voice alongside other materials. And we didn't want to just bring in these ex-colonial bodies and their stories, because we didn't want to reproduce a militaristic and what often is a royalistic notion of war and memory. We wanted to think of the global dead. So we didn't have an add-in model of multiculturalism we were working with. So the story begins, if it ever does begin anywhere, in the Coventry Cathedral. This is the most personal project I've actually undertaken, and I think it's interesting. I had to be in the academy for over 20 years before I felt comfortable to do this project. So Coventry is my city, as you can tell from my accent, and it was bombed in World War II. It's, a classic story of post-war construction comes with the bombing, and this new cathedral was created, designed by Basil Spence. There's lots of well-known artworks in this cathedral, and a new war requiem was written for the opening by Benjamin Britten for the cathedral. However, the voices and the material signs of the people who were also in that city, lots of people from the city, from the colonies, who would have participated themselves in World War II and even won, or had relatives who did that, their stories were not in the cathedral. They were not in the cathedral. And therefore we wanted to open that up. And we did this through using a form, actually, oral history, that is called call and response. And you might want to dip into that if you're thinking about how to generate collaboration. So call and response is essentially whereby I might say something to you, you say something back to me, and I return. But you can also, we stretch that to, you can do that through different professions and materials. So in the first stage, we as academics produced an archive of materials, which we gave to a poet. He then generated a response to the materials, and asked his grandfather in poetry about his time in World War II in the Indian British Army, and then of the evasions, or what Stuart Hall calls the amnesia of empire's presence in war. And they created a poetic exchange in Urdu, which was recorded in a studio. This was then given to a musician called Nitin Sawhney, and then a film was created by Kuldip to the soundtrack. So it's a call and response in exchange of collaboration. And in fact, I've used this method quite a lot now on smaller scale projects. It's really interesting if you want to do collaborative work and to allow for exchange, but also autonomy, because that's usually an issue in terms of how much autonomy do different professionals have in the exchange. Because power undoubtedly comes up in any kind of exchange. Right, so we worked with the cathedral topography and tried to reposition how we place images and sounds. And so for the launch, Francis Silkstone, who created the second piece, which was a music piece alone called Post-Colonial War Requiem, he had the musicians walking in actually from the back of the cathedral. So traditionally musicians are on the stage, but he had them walking in from the back, and I don't have time to go into his whole piece now, but we basically tried to rethink the space of the cathedral. So it was first performed, the film was shown, and the performance in 2008. It was a very public event, which was opened by Martin Bell and also by the historian Carolyn Steedman, who's a local historian at Warwick University. Prior to the performance, we had a conference in the day on war, sound and memory, and actually Patelli was one of our speakers at that conference. But interestingly, we were invited back in 2010 to do a smaller version of the screening and the performance. So basically, we spent quite a lot of time and money on this public event. And we also collected oral histories to think through how people responded to our curation on the time. So Vox Pox quick interviews were collected by students on the night to see what their responses were, but also more extensive interviews after the event with people who were there. We had something in the region of 400 people, and this is one of the responses. So I'm not going to read it out, but you can see how people were connecting the architecture. So it was site-specific. It was a public piece of work that's site-specific. And it worked in a particular way because it was Coventry Cathedral. And this person was pushing me to take it to Westminster Abbey, which I haven't tried to do at all. It's another few years of work to try and just negotiate that sort of thing. Yes, so I think that covers some of my projects that I've been working on, but I'm happy to deal with questions or for you to come and see me one-to-one. And certainly in the lunch hour we can talk through the exhibition in the corridor. In fact, you might want to, our title is called Migrating Dreams and Nightmares, because there's usually nightmares associated with migration, especially now, in spectacular discussions of migration, and that's not necessarily a good thing. But usually there's always another aspect to it. Dreams are inherently tied up with the nightmares of migration. So you might want to think of our wider theme, migrating dreams and nightmares, and how maybe one image or quote contributes to that, because if you want to curate your work and make it public, you will have to think of those manifestations. And I have to say, we're not trained in curating, and we didn't want to be trained in curating because we wanted to work with people who have the skills already, but at the same time we're really committed to questioning what happens in a space or what's allowed to happen. Also, what else could happen? More excitedly, yes.
Thank you.